Hello, I'm Fred Stella, President of the Interfaith Dialogue Association. Welcome to another edition of Common Threads. Last week, we began our conversation with Lynn Picknett. She is the co-author of a book called When God Had a Wife, The Fall and Rise of the Sacred Feminine in the Judeo-Christian Tradition. Well, this week, we are speaking to her co-author, Clive Prince, and we're going to continue our conversation about the sacred feminine in ancient Jewish culture and how that translated also into Christianity. A bit about our guest. Since 1989, Clive Prince, along with Lynn Picknett, have researched historical and religious mysteries, authoring such bestsellers as The Stargate Conspiracy and The Templar Revelations. They're frequent speakers at conferences and have appeared on such TV shows as Forbidden History and History's Ultimate Spies. So please welcome to Common Threads, Clive Prince. Hello, Clive.
Hello, Fred. Hi, good to be here.
Yes, we had a great conversation with Lynn last week, and so you've got a tough act to follow. Just thought I'd mention that. But let's start out by talking about the Genesis of Genesis. You mentioned in the book that much of Genesis, you believe, is imported from Egypt. What sort of evidence do we have that might be the case?
There are quite a lot of threads in the book of Genesis that point back to an Egyptian origin for various aspects of the religion that the Israelites brought into Israel. You know, after the Exodus from Egypt, and the extent of the actual influence of the Egyptian religion on the religion of Moses has always been sort of controversial and debatable. According to the Standard Line, it really owed nothing to it, but we think there was actually a stronger connection. I mean, most people have probably heard the idea that there's a connection between the religion of Moses and the religion of the pharaoh Akhenaten, who is believed to be one of the first monotheists, which, strangely enough, we don't go so much with that, because largely on the grounds we don't think that Moses was a monotheist, along with the rest of the Israelites. The gods that they worshipped, Yahweh, was, we think, and I think the evidence is very strong, just one of a number of gods that they had decided that they had a kind of special relationship with. He was kind of like their god, but they didn't think that he was the only one. But there are quite a lot of aspects of the Egyptian religion that come in. You look at things, for example, like the Ark of the Covenant, the design of that, the cherubim that were on the Ark of the Covenant, which seem to be much more of have a much greater connection to Egyptian artifacts. There are Egyptian names throughout the characters in Genesis, the important ones, particularly the priests. Moses himself, as most people know, is an Egyptian name. That's explained in the story, obviously, by him having been brought up by an Egyptian priestess, even though he was one of the Hebrews. But you keep getting these Egyptian names, so particularly amongst the priesthood. If there's a character called Phineas, there's a character called Hophni. These were all part of the tribe of Levi. These were Egyptian names. There's a character called Merari. Lynn and I also argue that Miriam, Moses' sister, comes from an Egyptian word meaning beloved as well. So there's all kinds of connections there, that at least the core priesthood of them were actually Egyptian and maintaining Egyptian religious ideas.
I realize that this might call for a great deal of speculation, but go ahead and speculate. Why do you think that monotheism was unpopular in the ancient world, and we're not talking just about the Israelites, we're just talking everywhere, there tends to be a focus on polytheism.
Yeah. I mean, my thought is that actually polytheism comes much more naturally to people. Monotheism, in a way, I have to say, doesn't. You know, we're as human beings, we don't seem that comfortable with the idea of one God. So even when we have monotheistic religions, say with Christianity, say with Catholic Christianity, we always have to start putting kind of, in a way, minor God figures in there. We call them saints, or we might look upon them as angels. So I don't think that monotheism really comes that naturally to people, and it tends to be something that comes along when you have a very powerful state, you know, that wants to kind of keep everything to itself. You know, for example, Christianity becoming the religion of the Roman Empire. You have Judaism emerging as a monotheistic religion, because as I was saying, it wasn't originally, a time when the authorities in Jerusalem are really trying to nail their authority and pin everybody under it. So I think it's something that just it doesn't come that naturally to people, and it didn't come naturally, say, to the Israelites. The evidence is very clear that they acknowledged the existence of other gods alongside their great God Yahweh or Jehovah, the one they had this special relationship with. But not just acknowledged other gods beside him, but the fact he had a consort, had a wife, as gods were expected to in the ancient world. And it's only really in round about the year 450 BC that you really get this kind of what is called monolatry, the worship of one God, even though you acknowledge others, kind of hardens into monotheism. And it always seems to be connected in some way with control and authority. When people really want to exert their authority over people, they kind of they do away with the other gods and goddesses and just pin themselves down to, this is the God you have to worship.
Would you say that perhaps the development of the concept of a Trinity also fed into that need, even though, of course, Christians would absolutely deny that it is any form of polytheism, but do you see that as an underlying way to appease that part of our mentality?
I do. I mean, not just... First of all, you have the Trinity. Well, it's almost a kind of echo of the Egyptian Trinity in the Egyptian religion. But the big difference there is the Egyptian Trinity was father, mother, and child, so it had a feminine element to it. As we point out in the book, in the Trinity, the Holy Spirit was originally feminine, because it's not just that people have a need for, a natural feeling for polytheism, but those gods also include, both male and female deities. So the Trinity originally was, I think, very much that, particularly by bringing in what was original, the female Holy Spirit. So yes, I would agree that there is part of this, along with things like, for example, the Virgin Mary, who is, a goddess in all but name. In Christianity, and particularly Catholic Christianity. I know they'd be horrified to actually hear that word, but when you think about it, she has pretty much the same function as the goddesses in the ancient world.
Well, certainly, yes, they would make arguments and give examples of why she wouldn't be called a goddess. To some Catholics, she is a co-mediatrix. That's pretty powerful. That's just perhaps a step below. What is the difference between angels and sons of God?
Originally, we would say there wasn't one, because if you look at the original words in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament to Christians, they do talk about other gods and sons of God. These are the earliest known versions of these books, which were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in the later versions that we have, the gods have been changed to angels. So we would say originally there was no difference between them. It's become different. It's passed into when they made the religion monotheistic, they changed the other gods and the sons of gods to angels. So ever since, for the last couple of thousand years, we've read about angels. So we now have a whole lot of angel lore. But originally they were the minor deities. We look back on the religions of the ancient world, and they all had these hierarchies of gods and goddesses, normally with one supreme creator god at the top. But in the end, it's just arguing about the meaning of words or the translation of words. But in terms of actual function, angels and gods are the same thing.
You say in the book that God, in the form of El, was described anthropomorphically, such as walking in the cool of the day, and that he ate with the patriarchs. And that, I remember walking in the cool of the day. I don't remember him eating with patriarchs.
Yes, he would. There are stories in the book of Genesis where God would actually sort of appear to people, not appear in the sort of form of a vision. He would kind of walk into shot, as it were, and have conversations, with various patriarchs. Even at one point, he even wrestles with Jacob for reasons that really aren't explained in the book. But this sort of anthropomorphic portrayal of El in the book of Genesis is important because the character, the word translated as God in the book of Genesis and translated as God throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible, there are actually two words. There is El and there is Yahweh. Yahweh is translated as the Lord, but it's assumed to be one and the same as God. So God is El, Yahweh is the Lord. They're normally taken to be two titles of the same being. But the way they're portrayed in the Hebrew Bible is very different. In Genesis, you have El. He's only ever El in Genesis. And he is a very anthropomorphic figure, walks in the cool of the day. He makes man in his own image, and various other things. And he's described as this basically as being like a person. Then you get to the point of where Moses and his experience with the burning bush, which is when God reveals himself to Moses. That's when the name changes, and the name changes to Yahweh. And the form is entirely different. Where he basically doesn't really have a form, or not one that he will reveal to people. Also, he doesn't even reveal his name. The name is just sort of I am who I say I am kind of thing. So you have this change from a very God with a specific form and a specific name, suddenly to a nameless God that has no real form or won't reveal his form, which incidentally is a very Egyptian concept of the nameless and formless God. It's one that was, for example, we draw a very close parallel with the Egyptian god Amun, who was also formless and well, his name really means the nameless one. And it's this change from the Book of Genesis and El through to Yahweh as El being the creator God, the great God, to Yahweh being the God of the Israelites, which we argue in the book. Yahweh originally begins as one of the sons of El, and is only much later, when the religion becomes monotheistic, are the two conflated. So they're actually two quite separate beings, two separate deities.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to Common Threads on WGVU FM. I'm Fred Stella, and with me today is Clive Prince. He is the co-author of When God Had a Wife, The Fall and Rise of the Sacred Feminine in the Judeo-Christian Tradition. Clive, I mentioned this to Lynn last week, that I was very impressed with there's an academic rigor about this book, although my understanding is that the two of you are not officially academics, but you really, the book is very well resourced. And one of your great inspirations is a work by the name of someone in academia named Raphael Patai. It's called Hebrew Goddess. It came out in 1967. And you say that when it came out, there was a lot of skepticism about it, but that it has been vindicated via archaeology. First of all, what new information do we have that vindicates him? And well, I'll save the second for after you answer that.
Right. Well, Raphael Patay's work, which was absolutely key and seminal, it came out in the 60s, as you said. Came out right in the middle of the counterculture and hippie thing, and it kind of hit the feeling of that time. Although Raphael Patay, by all accounts, was a very conventional and quite conservative figure. He certainly wasn't a hippie. And his book, it's about the sacred feminine throughout Jewish history. It's more about actually the Middle Ages and post-Christian era, but it does start obviously with the Old Testament, and that's when he is talking about Asherah as and he's just basing this purely on reading between the lines of the biblical account. So he's talking about Asherah as the consort, the spouse of Yahweh, and very scholarly and based on analysis of the language and the translation. But since then, there's been archaeological discoveries that have absolutely backed up what Raphael Patay said. They have found actually inscriptions on pottery and on stones, actually to Yahweh and his Asherah. They found figurines of Asherah, and there's been a lot more work done on the textual side as well. So that book was way ahead of its time, but it has proven to really stand the test of time. And there's a lot of evidence now that backs it up. So the most compelling, I think, being the archaeology, the figurines, and the inscriptions.
Well, and you say that the establishment tried to dismiss him, meaning the academic establishment. And I can understand if he was working for Fuller Theological Seminary or Wheaton College, but why secular institutions like Harvard? Why would they be concerned about rocking the theological boat?
Yeah. I think it's just too, for the time, particularly in the 1960s, way too controversial, way too radical, way too overturning, too much of the way people thought. Everyone had been brought up to think that Judaism was always a monotheistic religion from the time of Moses, from the time of Abraham. And suddenly to have somebody taking such a sort of radical position, really rocking the boat so much, that was that was the reason. It was just too radical at the time. But what's interesting is that what Raphael Paté said in that book in 1967, because of all this other evidence that's come around, this is now the standard. One of the reasons that Lynn and I wrote the book was to pull together all these different strands of evidence and really sort of put them in one place, to make people aware of actually how much evidence that there is for God having a wife, the Old Testament God having a wife, and the continuation of the sacred feminine throughout Jewish and into Christian history. As you say, neither Lynn and I are academics, certainly in that way, but we know how to read an academic textbook. We know how to, we know our way around these subjects because we've been researching them for 30 years. So what we really wanted to do was pull all this stuff together and put it in one place, so that, because all this is scattered around in, a theological or a biblical studies journal here, and another bit is in another journal there, and some other stuff is in an archaeology book. So we wanted to put it in one place to show how this is now, what was kind of shocking and controversial back in 1967 when the Hebrew Goddess was written, has now become the orthodoxy as far as historians and academia is concerned. So it's, Raphael Paté's completely won the day, and that is now the standard line. But most people in churches and synagogues and so on really aren't aware of this. We wanted to just make them aware of all this amazing information.
If you would, could you talk about Ruth Hestrin of the Israeli Museum and her contribution to this kind of work?
Yes, Ruth Hestrin was put another major piece of this jigsaw together, following on from Raphael Paté, and it's quite a complex chain of imagery and arguments to go through now. It's set out in the book, but it's basically she realised there was a whole series of images that were relating to Asherah, or the wife of Yahweh, although nobody had yet realized this image. It was just an association of ideas on particular images to do with trees and to do with goats. And Ruth Hestrin had put all this stuff together and realized that these images that had been found, archaeologists had found, that had been produced in ancient Israel, but they didn't really know what they were. She could show by this whole chain of associations and reasoning that actually they were images representing Asherah, the goddess, the Israelite, the Hebrew goddess. But Ruth Hestrin, she had a higher position in the Jerusalem Museum in Israel, but she wasn't an academic, and nobody really wanted to know. Nobody was interested in what she said. She was in the museum, the Israeli museum, looking at these images, and this is how she worked out that they were images of Asherah. And she wrote a paper about it, but because she didn't actually have the right academic qualifications, really nobody wanted to know. It was only when she got in touch with an archaeologist named William Deaver, who's written a lot about the archaeology of this. The archaeology of the Hebrew goddess was originally inspired by Raphael Paté, I have to say. That when Ruth Hestrin showed William Deaver this paper, he then managed to get it published in an archaeological journal, and now it's kind of passed into, again, it was something that was controversial to start with. Nobody wanted to know, partly because she didn't have the right qualifications. But now it's accepted, although it's not always attributed to Ruth Estrin, I have to say.
Clive, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. We're down to the wire for this edition of Common Threads, but it is a fascinating and very well-researched book, and I wish you the best of luck with it.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me on, and thank you for your kind words about the book. It's something that we really love to put together, and we do think it's got an important message. So, we're very happy that it's out there now, so thank you.
Certainly. And once again, the name of the book, When God Had a Wife, The Fall and Rise of the Sacred Feminine in the Judeo-Christian Tradition, by our guest today, Clive Prince, and his co-author, Lynn Picknett. And if you want to know more about what they're both up to, you can go to picknettprince.com, and that's Picknett, then prince.com. You're listening to Common Threads here on WGVU. I'm Fred Stella. Please join us again next week, right here on WGVU.